The morning mist clung to the Niagara River like a shroud, a thick, swirling veil that concealed the frantic movements of men preparing for battle on both shores. Major General Isaac Brock stood at the edge of Queenston Heights, his boots damp with dew, his gaze piercing the haze, fixed on the indistinct American shore across the turbulent, gray water. In the cold, gray dawn of October 13, 1812, the opening salvo of what would become a defining confrontation in the War of 1812 was about to begin. This was not merely another border clash. It was a concentrated essence of the war's grand themes: expansion versus defense, amateur zeal versus professional discipline, and the fraught birth of national identities. "They will cross before noon," Brock muttered, more to himself than to his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel John McDonnell, who stood solemnly beside him. "We must be ready. See that the men at the Redan are vigilant. That battery is the key." This engagement, though a single day's brutal work, would resonate far beyond the river valley. It would become the Battle of Queenston Heights, a turning point in the War of 1812, a moment that irrevocably altered the conflict's trajectory, reshaped military doctrines on both sides, forged legends from mortal men, and began to crystallize a new consciousness among the disparate peoples of British North America. The war between Great Britain and the United States had been raging for mere months, but the tensions that fueled it had been smoldering for over a decade. American expansionist ambitions, a driving force that would later be codified as manifest destiny, clashed directly with British imperial interests and the fragile security of its Canadian colonies. British naval practices of impressing American sailors into service and economic sanctions imposed through trade restrictions had provided the immediate casus belli. But for many war hawks in the American Congress, the true prize was the fertile land to the north. The conflict presented a seemingly perfect opportunity to seize British North America, while the British Lion was desperately distracted by the life-and-death struggle against Napoleon in Europe. President James Madison had signed the declaration of war on June 18, 1812, setting in motion military plans that were long on optimism and short on practical logistics. On the critical Niagara frontier, command of the American forces fell to Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a Federalist politician and wealthy patroon with deep roots in New York, but with lamentably little military experience. His opposite number, Major General Isaac Brock, was a career soldier of 28 years' experience, a man who had honed his skills in Europe and the Caribbean before being entrusted with the defense of Upper Canada, a vast and sparsely populated territory he knew was vulnerable. Van Rensselaer's mandate was clear: launch an invasion across the Niagara River, break the British defensive line, and open the path to conquest. His plan was straightforward to the point of simplicity: cross the river under cover of darkness, secure a foothold at the strategically located village of Queenston, and then advance north along the river road to capture the critical British bastion at Fort George. On paper, his resources seemed ample. He had at his disposal roughly 1,300 regular United States Army soldiers and nearly 3,000 New York State militia, a force that, if fully committed, would significantly outnumber the British defenders scattered across the Niagara Peninsula. Yet this numerical superiority was an illusion, fractured by a fatal weakness. The militia, by both law and long-standing suspicion of federal power, believed their service obligation did not extend beyond the borders of their own state. This constitutional and philosophical fault line lay hidden beneath the surface of the invasion plan, waiting for the moment of supreme pressure to crack it wide open. As the first feeble light of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky, American artillery batteries on the high ground around Lewiston opened fire. The bombardment targeted the cluster of homes that was Queenston Village, and more importantly, the British 18-pounder battery positioned in a small earthwork redan on the heights above. The thunderous roar of cannon fire echoed down the river valley, shattering the morning calm and sending birds wheeling into the sky in frantic clouds. For the men waiting in the villages and forts, the sound was a definitive end to anticipation and a stark beginning to the day's deadly work. Captain James Dennis, a tough and reliable officer of the 49th Regiment of Foot, commanded the forward British position in Queenston village itself. Alongside a small detachment of York militia, his company formed the thin red line that would receive the invasion's first blow. They were vastly outnumbered by the force assembling on the opposite shore, but they held two key advantages: the formidable, swift current of the Niagara River and the commanding high ground of the heights. According to accounts later published in the Times of London in late 1812, the American forces and their political masters believed their numerical superiority would guarantee a swift and relatively bloodless victory. They profoundly underestimated both the tactical acumen of General Brock and the tenacity of the British regulars and Canadian militia, who were fighting not for imperial glory alone, but in defense of their homes and farms. The first American boats, a mismatched collection of skiffs and scows, pushed off from the New York shore in the inky pre-dawn darkness. From the very outset, the invasion was plagued by misfortune, poor planning, and the fierce natural obstacle of the river itself. The boats were too few, the oarsmen inexperienced, and the plan for coordinated waves quickly fell apart. The Niagara's strong current gripped the overloaded vessels, spinning them and sweeping them far downstream from the intended landing point at the base of the heights. Some boats landed a mile or more away, isolating their occupants. Others, through sheer effort, made it to the chosen spot, but the operation began in severe and demoralizing disarray. The first wave was led by Lieutenant Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer, the general's cousin and a genuine professional soldier whose courage was never in doubt. As his boat grounded on the rocky Canadian shore, a volley of musket fire from Captain Dennis's pickets greeted them. Van Rensselaer was hit multiple times in the legs and thigh, but displaying tremendous grit, he refused to be evacuated. He dragged himself up the bank, rallying his scattered men and establishing a precarious, bloody foothold on the hostile shore. Captain Dennis and his outnumbered force fought with disciplined ferocity, contesting every yard of ground. However, as more and more American boats straggled in, adding their numbers to the bridgehead, the British position became untenable. After a sharp, close-quarters fight, Dennis was forced to order a fighting retreat back through Queenston village toward the base of the heights, leaving the Americans in temporary control of the landing site. The first phase had gone, albeit messily, to the invaders. Word of the American crossing reached Major General Brock at his headquarters in Fort George, several miles to the north, just as the sky was lightening. He had anticipated the blow would fall here, at the narrowest part of the river. Without a moment's hesitation, he mounted his horse, Alfred, and rode at full gallop toward the sound of the guns at Queenston, ordering his remaining forces to follow with all possible speed. This immediate, personal rush to the point of maximum danger exemplified the hands-on leadership that had already earned him the fierce loyalty of his soldiers and the settler population. He was not a commander who directed from the rear. As Brock and his small staff pounded south along the river road, the situation at the front was evolving with alarming speed. The initial American success was being brilliantly exploited. Captain John Wool, a young, intrepid regular army officer who had taken command of the lead elements after Solomon Van Rensselaer's incapacitation, made a discovery that would change the tactical picture entirely. A local farmer, terrified or perhaps coerced, revealed the existence of a narrow, winding fisherman's path that scaled the seemingly impregnable cliff face of the heights north of the village. This path was unmapped and unknown to the British defenders, who believed the escarpment was secure. Seizing the initiative, Wool led a detachment of regulars up this treacherous path. They climbed silently, single file clutching at roots and rocks, while the attention of the remaining British forces was fixed on the skirmishing in the village below. After an arduous ascent, they emerged onto the summit plateau, behind and above the British battery in the Redan. With a sudden, fierce charge, they overwhelmed the small guard left to protect the guns. In a stunning reversal, the key to the battlefield, the 18-pounder cannon that had been raking the American landing site, fell silent and then, moments later, was turned by its new captors. The American flag, raised over the captured position, now fluttered defiantly against the morning sky. It was this sight that greeted Brock as he reined in his horse at the outskirts of Queenston village. The strategic picture was dire. The Americans held the landing site, were consolidating in the village, and now commanded the commanding heights. The psychological blow of seeing their own flag on the high ground was devastating to the British and Canadian troops milling in confusion. For Brock, the calculation was immediate and stark. Every moment the Americans held that height, they grew stronger and the chance of dislodging them diminished. With barely 100 men gathered around him, a mix of regulars from the 49th who had rallied from the village fight and local militia, he made a fateful decision. He would not wait for the reinforcements marching from Fort George. He would attack now, directly up the main slope, and retake the Redan in a single, furious stroke. "We must regain the high ground," Brock declared, his voice cutting through the din of scattered musket fire. "The fate of the province depends upon it. That gun must be silenced." Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, ever cautious, urged restraint. "Sir, perhaps we should wait for Norton and his warriors, or at least until more men arrive from Fort George. A direct assault up that slope is perilous." But Brock was resolute, his mind fixed on the tactical imperative and the morale effect of a swift counterblow. "If we delay, they will dig in and bring more men across. We will lose this opportunity. Follow me." The Quebec Gazette later reported that General Brock's decision to lead from the front rather than direct from a place of safety was characteristic of his bold leadership style, a style that inspired his men but also exposed him to great peril. Though it ultimately cost the Empire one of its most capable commanders in North America, the paper noted, his action in that moment was that of a man who understood that in colonial warfare, will and momentum often trumps mere numbers. What followed was an act of breathtaking bravery and tragic futility. Brock, in his brilliant scarlet uniform and gold lace, a conspicuous target, placed himself at the head of his meager force. He drew his sword, pointed it toward the summit, and began to lead the advance up the steep, open slope. The men, inspired by his example, gave a cheer and followed. It was a scene of antiquated gallantry met by modern firepower. Captain Wool's Americans, now well positioned behind the captured earthworks and sheltered by trees and rocks, held their fire until the Scarlet Line was within effective range. Then they unleashed a disciplined, withering volley. The sound was like a great sheet tearing. Men in the front rank of the British advance fell. Still, Brock urged them on, waving his sword. He was perhaps 30 yards from the leading edge of the American position when a single musket ball, likely fired by a sharpshooter, struck him squarely in the chest. He fell instantly, collapsing to the wet ground. His final words, as reported by a soldier who stumbled to his side, were, "Push on, brave York volunteers." Within minutes, the defender of Upper Canada was dead. The shock of his fall was physical. The advance faltered, then stalled. MacDonald, in a furious effort to honor his fallen commander and salvage the attack, rallied a few dozen men and led a second, desperate charge on horseback. He too was shot down, mortally wounded. With both commanders felled, the heart went out of the counterattack. The surviving British and Canadian troops retreated back down the slope in disarray, leaving the heights firmly in American hands. The time was not yet 8:00 in the morning. By mid-morning, the battle appeared to have reached its decisive, irreversible conclusion. The Americans held every tactical advantage, the commanding heights, control of the village landing site, and they had decapitated the British command. Across the river, rows of American militia and reserves stood watching, awaiting orders to cross and exploit the victory. On the Canadian side, confusion reigned. The surviving British officers in Queenston village, leaderless and dispirited, could only organize a ragged defensive perimeter, and wait for the inevitable next blow. Captain Wool, wounded but still active, sent urgent messages back across the river pleading for reinforcements to cement their triumph. For a few critical hours, the path to a strategic American breakthrough on the Niagara frontier lay open, the door to Upper Canada seemingly kicked ajar. Command on the Heights devolved to Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott, a 26-year-old regular Army officer of towering height, 6 feet 4 inches, and corresponding ambition, who had just arrived with a small reinforcement. He began energetically organizing the defensive position, deploying his men in a crescent-shaped line facing the village and trying to instill order among the mix of regulars and volunteers. Yet, even as he worked, he could see ominous developments below. British and Canadian reinforcements were now streaming into the village from the north, their formations orderly. More disquieting still, from the northern tree line emerged a force that struck a primal fear into the hearts of his men. Mohawk warriors, their faces painted, led by the formidable Captain John Norton, a war chief of mixed Scottish-Cherokee ancestry who was a staunch and effective British ally. The warriors moved with a silent, predatory grace that contrasted sharply with the rigid lines of European soldiers. It was at this moment of apparent American ascendancy that the battle, and consequently the strategic direction of the war on the Niagara front, began to turn. The turning point was not triggered by a single, glorious cavalry charge, but by a fatal confluence of American institutional failure and swift, calculated British adaptation. The first and most catastrophic element was the failure of the New York militia. As the morning wore on and the desperate need for reinforcements on the Canadian shore became screamingly obvious, the expected flood of men from the New York shore simply did not materialize. General Van Rensselaer, from his headquarters on the eastern bank, pleaded, threatened, and exhorted his militia units. He was met with stony resistance. The militia officers and men, citing their constitutional rights and a deep-seated reluctance to serve beyond their state's borders, refused to board the boats. The spectacle was one of surreal paralysis. Thousands of fresh troops stood idle on one bank, while their outnumbered comrades fought for survival on the other, within plain sight. This constitutional and moral failure created an unbridgeable chasm between the American regulars trapped on the Heights and the overwhelming majority of the invasion force. The second element of the turn was the arrival and cool-headed response of the new British commander, Major General Roger Hale Sheaffe. A veteran of the British Army who had served in Canada for years, Sheaffe was in every respect the antithesis of Brock. Where Brock had been impetuous, charismatic, and personally daring, Sheaffe was methodical, cautious, and somewhat aloof, a professional soldier more comfortable with systematic maneuver than with spur-of-the-moment heroism. He arrived at Queenston from Fort George with the main body of reinforcements around 11:00 a.m. to be greeted with the grim news of Brock's death and the loss of the Heights. Sheaffe's first act was to take firm command, quelling the panic and imposing order on the gathering forces in the village. He understood immediately, with a clarity Brock's passionate commitment had perhaps obscured, that another frontal assault up the same bloody slope would be futile and destructive. Instead, he devised a patient, cunning plan that played to his strengths of organization and combined arms. Gathering his forces, which now included the bulk of the 41st Regiment, the remnants of the 49th, several companies of York and Lincoln militia, and Norton's Mohawk warriors, Sheaffe did not march directly toward the enemy. Instead, he turned his column inland, beginning a wide, circuitous flanking march to the north and west. "We shall not repeat the general's gallant but costly direct assault," Sheaffe informed his senior officers, his tone leaving no room for debate. "The enemy holds a strong position. We will turn it. We will circle around to the top of the Heights, beyond their left flank, and engage them on ground of our own choosing." While Sheaffe's force made its slow, deliberate, and hidden march, the situation for the Americans on the Heights deteriorated from one of victory into one of grim entrapment. Lieutenant Colonel Scott had organized a defensive perimeter, But his men were exhausted, ammunition was running low, and the promised reinforcements were a bitter joke. The morale-sapping sight of the idle militia masses across the river, close enough to see individual faces but utterly beyond reach, was a poison in the ranks. General Van Rensselaer, utterly frustrated and humiliated, crossed the river himself in a final attempt to lead but found the morale collapse was complete. He returned to the New York shore and sent a final, despairing message to Scott. "I have done all that I could to send you reinforcements, but the militia utterly refused to embark. I cannot compel them. If you can effect a retreat, save your troops." Retreat, however, was a physical impossibility. The few serviceable boats were gone, and the only path down was the steep, exposed cliff face to the raging river. Scott and his men were not just defeated, they were besieged on their own captured high ground, with their backs to a precipice. For nearly 3 hours, Sheaffe's column marched, a tense period of waiting and gathering dread for the Americans. Then, around 3:00 in the afternoon, the deliberate nature of Sheaffe's strategy bore its devastating fruit. His force emerged in perfect, disciplined order from the tree line at the western end of the Heights Plateau, completely turning the American left flank. Sheaffe had formed his men into a classic line of battle. The red-coated regulars of the 41st and 49th Regiments in the center, the green-jacketed Canadian militia extending the line to the right, and Norton's Mohawk warriors, who had melted into the woods, threatening the American flank and rear with their terrifying, unnerving style of warfare. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Scott's Americans, now numbering about 600 exhausted men, were forced to wheel their entire line to face this new threat, exposing their previous rear. British artillerymen who had manhandled 2 light guns along the flanking route began firing spherical case shot into the compacting American position. Then, to the steady beat of drums, the entire British line advanced, a wall of scarlet and green and steel, their bayonets catching the slanting afternoon light. The advance was slow, relentless, and terrifyingly quiet save for the drums, and the war cries of the Mohawks echoing from the woods. Scott, a pillar of resolve, strode behind his shrinking line, shouting encouragement. "Stand firm, men. Make every shot count. The honor of your country is in your hands." For perhaps 45 minutes, pockets of American regulars, particularly those under Scott's immediate eye, held their ground with remarkable discipline, trading volleys with the advancing British regulars. But the pressure was inexorable and multi-fronted. Ammunition began to fail. The sight of the Mohawks flitting through the trees and the knowledge that no escape existed eroded the will of the militia volunteers. When the British line closed to within 50 yards, it halted. A single, shattering volley erupted from hundreds of muskets, a blast of smoke and lead that tore through the American ranks. Before the smoke could clear, the order "charge" rang out and the British line surged forward with a great roar, bayonets leveled. The American line, what was left of it, shattered. Some men broke and ran for the cliff edge. Some threw down their arms, and small knots of regulars fought on until overwhelmed. Seeing that further resistance meant slaughter for no purpose, Winfield Scott made the agonizing decision that defines a professional soldier's duty in defeat. He would surrender to save his men. Tearing a white handkerchief from his pocket, he tied it to the blade of his sword and raised it high above the swirling smoke. General Sheaffe, observing the signal, immediately ordered a ceasefire. The sudden silence that fell over Queenston Heights was almost more deafening than the battle's noise, broken only by the pitiful cries of the wounded. Scott, with immense dignity given the circumstances, walked forward to formally surrender his sword and his command. Sheaffe, in a gesture of professional respect between soldiers, received him courteously, returned his sword, and offered honorable terms. All prisoners would be treated with dignity, officers would retain their personal sidearms, and the wounded would receive immediate medical care alongside the British casualties. The final accounting revealed the scale of the reversal and the price of the turning point. American losses were catastrophic. Approximately 925 men taken prisoner, including 70 officers like Scott himself. Around 90 were killed and 100 wounded on the heights. British and Canadian casualties were significantly lighter, totaling fewer than 130, but they included the irreplaceable loss of Isaac Brock and John McDonnell. As the long column of American prisoners was marched off toward Fort George, the magnitude of the achievement began to sink in among the victors. Against greater numbers, after the catastrophic loss of their inspirational leader, through a combination of regular discipline, militia steadfastness, crucial indigenous alliance, and most pivotally, adaptive and cool-headed leadership, they had not only repelled an invasion but had annihilated the attacking force. The aftermath of Queenston Heights solidified its status as a true and multifaceted turning point. The immediate strategic effect was the complete and utter securing of the Niagara frontier for the remainder of 1812. The American army on that front was shattered, its offensive capability broken, and its morale destroyed. General Van Rensselaer resigned his commission in disgrace within days, and American political and military ambitions for a quick, easy conquest of Canada evaporated overnight. The war would now be a protracted struggle, a reality for which the United States was poorly prepared. For the British and Canadians, the victory provided an indispensable, life-saving morale boost. It proved to the skeptical settlers, many of whom were recent American immigrants, that the colony could and would be defended. It bought crucial time for the reinforcement and organization of Upper Canada's defenses. The battle also forced a fundamental and lasting reevaluation of military strategy and structure on both sides, another hallmark of a pivotal encounter. For the United States, the defeat was a brutal, public lesson in the utter inadequacy of relying on untrained, short-term militia for complex offensive operations. The spectacle of the militia's refusal became a national scandal and a powerful, enduring argument in Congress for building a larger, better-trained and more professional-standing army. Winfield Scott, during his captivity in Quebec, studied British drill, discipline, and organization firsthand. Upon his release in a prisoner exchange, he became the war's most vocal and effective advocate for rigorous, European-style training. He drilled his own brigade to a peak of efficiency, and his subsequent career as commanding general of the U.S. Army for 2 decades was dedicated to institutionalizing those lessons. The seeds of a professional American military ethos, sown in the bitter soil of Queenston Heights, would bear fruit in the Mexican-American War and beyond. For the British command in Canada, the battle validated a critical shift in defensive strategy. Sheaffe's successful, cautious, combined arms flanking maneuver stood in stark contrast to Brock's heroic but costly direct assault. It demonstrated that in the vast, wooded terrain of North America, careful maneuver, the integration of light infantry and indigenous allies, and patience could achieve decisive results with fewer casualties. This more collaborative, tactical model, though less romantic than Brock's heroism, would heavily influence British defensive operations for the rest of the war, contributing to later successes. Perhaps the most profound and lasting turn initiated on those heights was in the realm of identity, memory, and mythology. In death, Isaac Brock was transfigured. The capable administrator and energetic general became a martyr and a national symbol. His fall became the foundational sacrifice in an emerging Canadian narrative, a story of loyal sacrifice against overwhelming odds. The phrase, "push on, brave York volunteers," entered the lexicon as a timeless call to patriotic duty. The successful defense, achieved by a collective of British regulars, English and French-Canadian militia, and Mohawk warriors, provided an early and powerful story of a shared pan-Canadian resistance against absorption by the United States. It fostered a sense of distinctness, a collective purpose born in battle that would gradually coalesce into a national consciousness. Brock's monument, which today stands 185 feet tall on the heights, is not merely a memorial to a general. It is a testament to this birth of a national myth, literally built upon the battle that helped define a future nation. Conversely, for the indigenous allies, particularly Norton's Mohawks, the battle represented both a zenith and a cruel irony. Their military contribution was decisive, their terrifying intervention breaking the American will at the critical moment. Yet, the broader war would ultimately fail to secure their primary goal, a sovereign territory or a firm British guarantee against American expansion. Their decisive role at Queenston Heights marked a high point of influence within the British alliance, a turning point toward the eventual erosion of their power and autonomy in the Great Lakes region, a tragic outcome born from a battle they were instrumental in winning. The Battle of Queenston Heights did not end the War of 1812. 2.5 more years of brutal seesaw fighting lay ahead, with cities like York and Washington put to the torch, and epic battles fought on the rolling waters of the Great Lakes. But October 13, 1812, marked the decisive turn where the initial American strategy of quick conquest died on the rocky slopes and in the misty air above the Niagara River. It forced a long, hard war of attrition for which the young republic was ill-prepared, and it confirmed the resilience and fighting spirit of the Canadian colonies. It transformed military thinking on both sides of the border, created enduring legends that shaped national stories, and set the psychological and strategic course for the remainder of the conflict. The trajectory of the war, and indeed the future political geography of a continent, pivoted on that crisp autumn day, when disaster was methodically turned into deliverance, and a new, collective sense of destiny began to take root on the wind-swept, blood-stained heights above the ever-flowing river.